Mark, a lonely waiter barely holding on to his quiet life, stood up for a brooding biker named Ryan one tense evening at Tony's Café, never knowing he was part of a tight-knit writers' crew. Moments after his firing, the distant rumble of hundreds of motorcycles echoed through the streets. Life was about to surprise him in the most unexpected way. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today, I'm going to share another heartwarming story. So let's dive into it. The afternoon sun peeked through the smudged windows of Tony's Café, casting a soft, hazy glow over the faded red booths. Mark stood behind the counter, scrubbing it with a damp rag, the faint scent of bleach tickling his nose. At 26, he'd been a waiter here for 5 years, long enough for the place to feel like a second skin. The cafe wasn't fancy, just a little spot on a sleepy street, but it was his world. The air hummed with the smell of strong coffee and fried onions, clinging to his worn apron like a shadow he couldn't shake. Mark stopped for a moment, brushing a strand of dark hair from his eyes. The clock above the door read 4:15 p.m., its hands creeping toward another long shift. He'd head home after, to a cramped apartment a block away, a single room with a lumpy couch, a flickering lamp, and silence that pressed in too close. No family waited for him. No friends dropped by. Just him, alone with the buzz of a TV that barely worked. Most days he didn't mind. He'd learned to live with the quiet, to wrap it around himself like a worn-out jacket. But today, it felt heavier, a dull ache he couldn't name. "Hey, Mark!" Lisa's voice rang out, sharp and playful as she leaned through the kitchen door. She was a year younger, all quick smiles and messy ponytails, her apron tied loose. "You taking my shift tomorrow? Got plans with a guy I met?" Mark gave her a small smile, the kind he always offered when someone asked for a favor. "Yeah, Lisa, I can do it." She grinned, popping a gum bubble. "You're too good, you know? People just step all over you." He shrugged, turning back to the counter, his rag squeaking against the surface. She wasn't wrong. Last week, old Mr. Jenkins, a regular with a gravelly laugh, had waved him over. "Mark, be a pal. Grab me some smokes from the store. I'll tip you big," he'd said, eyes glinting. Mark had jogged across the street, the sun hot on his back, and handed over the pack. Jenkins tossed him a quarter, chuckling with his buddies. "Thanks, kid," he'd said, like it was a game. Mark's cheeks had burned, but he'd just nodded and walked away. Saying no didn't come easy. He wanted to help, wanted people to like him, even if it never worked out that way. The bell above the door jingled, faint and tired, as a couple shuffled in, their voices low. Mark grabbed a menu, ready to move, but his eyes drifted to the scratched tabletop where he'd carved his initials years ago, M.W., barely visible now. He'd done it his first week, full of hope, thinking this job might lead somewhere. 5 years later, here he was, still wiping the same counter, still alone. His chest tightened, a quiet hurt bubbling up. He wondered if anyone saw him, really saw him, or if he'd always be the guy who said yes, the one they forgot the minute he turned away. "Mark, you daydreaming again," Lisa called, snapping him back. She smirked, balancing a tray. "Don't get lost in that head of yours." He forced a laugh, soft and shaky. "Just thinking," he said, but his voice carried a weight she didn't catch. He picked up the rag again, scrubbing harder, hoping one day someone might notice the heart behind it all. The bell above the door jingled, a small, weary chime that broke the stillness. Ryan stepped inside, his leather jacket creaking faintly, a hint of gasoline lingering in the air around him. At 28, he didn't fit the rowdy biker mold Mark might have pictured. His dark hair was a mess, flattened from the helmet he carried under his arm, and his eyes, deep and quiet, darted around the room before settling on a stool at the counter's far end. His boots scraped the worn linoleum as he sat, keeping his distance from the regulars sipping coffee in their booths. Ryan eased his helmet onto the counter, a soft clunk against the wood, and pulled a little leather journal from his pocket. Its cover was scuffed, edges rounded from years of being held, a quiet treasure he kept close. He flipped it open, fingers tracing the paper gently, like it was more than just pages to him. Mark watched from the corner of his eye, grabbing a menu as he stepped over. "Evening," Mark said, sliding it across with a small nod. "What'll you have?" Ryan glanced up, his voice soft but steady. "Coffee, Black." Mark turned to the coffee pot, pouring the dark brew into a mug with a tiny chip on the rim. He set it down, noticing the journal again. "You write in that?" he asked, his tone light, curious. Ryan's lips curved into a faint smile, almost bashful. "Sort of. Keeps my head clear." "Sounds nice," Mark said, a touch of longing in his voice. "Having something to lean on like that." "Yeah," Ryan said, his smile warming just a bit. "Helps when all I've got is the road." Mark paused, wiping his hands on his apron. "The road?" Ryan nodded toward the window, where a black motorcycle sat parked outside, its sleek frame glinting in the softening light. "Been riding since I was a kid," he said, his words quiet, like a secret. "It's where I get away." Mark peeked at the bike, its curves shining against the dull street. It looked free, wild, everything the cafe wasn't. "Must feel good," he said, soft and wistful, having a way out. Ryan's gaze drifted to the bike, a shadow crossing his face. "Sometimes," he murmured, picking up his pen, "sometimes it just keeps me moving." Mark didn't press, turning to fiddle with a stack of napkins. He liked Ryan's stillness. It wasn't cold, just real. But there was something heavy in the way Ryan bent over his journal, scribbling a line then pausing, like the words wouldn't come easy. Outside, the motorcycle stood alone, its chrome catching the last of the sun, a quiet promise of escape in a life that felt tethered. Ryan took a sip of coffee, the bitterness steadying him, and ran a thumb along the journal's edge. The road had been his lifeline since he was 16, a way to outrun a house full of shouting and empty promises. The bike's rumble swallowed the hurt, the loneliness that stuck to him like dirt. But lately, the rides didn't stretch far enough to shake it off, and that empty feeling crept back, soft but stubborn. He glanced at Mark, busy with his napkins, and saw a flicker of the same quiet ache, a loneliness they didn't need to name, hanging gentle and heavy in the air of Tony's Café. The bell jingled again, harsh and loud, snapping the quiet in two. Two teenagers shoved through the door, their laughter bouncing off the walls. They were all sharp edges, lanky arms, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, one in a crooked cap, the other drowning in a baggy hoodie. They strutted toward the counter, their voices loud enough to turn heads. Mark's hands froze on the napkins, a knot tightening in his chest. He knew that look, trouble brewing, ready to spill over. "Hey, check this guy out," the one in the cap said, nudging his friend as his eyes landed on Ryan. "Nice jacket, dude. What's it made of? Your mom's old purse?" Ryan didn't move, his pen hovering over the journal. He took another slow sip of coffee, the mug steady in his hand, but Mark saw the way his shoulders stiffened, the tiniest flinch in his jaw. The hoodie kid snickered, leaning closer. "Aw, he's too pretty to talk. Bet that bike outside's just for show, huh?" Mark's rag twisted tighter in his grip, the damp cloth cold against his palms. He glanced at Ryan, hunched over his journal, scribbling a shaky line like he could block them out. The cafe went quiet, the regulars peering over their cups, waiting to see what had happened. Mark's heart thudded hard, a familiar fear creeping up his throat. He wasn't good with this. Confrontation, standing up. He'd spent years ducking his head, letting the world roll over him. "What's wrong, biker boy?" the cap kid pressed, louder now, grinning wide. "You deaf or just scared?" Ryan's pen scratched harder, ink bleeding into the page. His knuckles whitened around the mug, but he kept his eyes down, his silence a shield. Mark's stomach churned. He'd seen this before, people picking at someone just because they could, because they thought quiet meant weak. It reminded him of himself, swallowing every jab from Lisa or Jenkins, hoping it'd stop if he stayed small. "Leave him alone," Mark muttered, so soft it barely left his lips. The Cap kid spun around, smirking. "What did you say, waiter?" Mark's breath caught, his chest tight like a coiled spring. He wasn't brave, never had been. His hands shook, the rag slipping a little, but something snapped inside him. Ryan's stillness, that quiet hurt in his eyes, it was too close, too familiar. He couldn't just watch this time. He straightened up, his voice trembling but clear. "I said leave him alone. He's not bothering you." The cafe went still, the air thick with surprise. The teenagers stared, then burst out laughing. "Oh, look at this!" the hoodie kid jeered, slapping the counter. "Waiter's playing hero!" The Cap kid stepped closer, his grin twisting. "What are you going to do about it, huh? Cry to your boss?" Mark's knees felt weak, his pulse pounding in his ears. He clutched the rag like a lifeline, but he didn't back down. "Just stop," he said, louder now, his voice cracking but firm. "He's drinking his coffee. That's all." Ryan looked up then, his dark eyes meeting Mark's for a fleeting second. Surprise, gratitude, maybe both flickering there. The regulars murmured, forks clinking against plates, but the teenagers didn't let up. "Aw, he's got a boyfriend now," the hoodie kid taunted, laughing harder. Mark's face burned, fear and anger tangling inside him. He wasn't tough, wasn't loud, but standing there, shaky and small, he felt something shift. A spark of courage he didn't know he had. The cafe's chipped mugs, the scratched counter, the hum of the old fridge, it all faded. And for once, he wasn't invisible. He was just a guy trying to do right, even if it scared him half to death. The kitchen door slammed open, the bang echoing through the cafe like a gunshot. Tony stormed out, his face flushed red, apron streaked with grease. His heavy steps thudded on the linoleum, and Mark's stomach dropped. "What the hell's going on here?" Tony barked, his voice rough and loud. The Cap kid smirked, leaning back. "Nothing, Tony. Just having fun." Tony's glare landed on Mark, sharp as a knife. "You stirring up trouble again?" "I wasn't—" Mark started, his voice cracking, thin and shaky. His hands clutched the rag, damp and cold, like it could hold him steady. Tony's eyes flicked to Ryan, still at the counter, journal open, pen frozen mid-line, then back to Mark, narrowing as the pieces clicked. "Wait a damn minute," he growled, stepping closer, his shadow looming. "You're sticking up for him? That biker?" Mark swallowed, his throat tight. "He didn't do anything, Tony. They were just—" "Shut it," Tony snapped, cutting him off. He jabbed a thick finger at Ryan, who sat still, mug in hand. "You bikers are not the kind of people we welcome here. Bad company, every one of you. Loud, dirty, scaring off good folks with your bikes and your stink." Ryan's jaw tightened, his fingers whitening around the mug, but he didn't look up. Mark's heart sank, guilt twisting inside him. He hadn't meant for this, hadn't wanted Ryan dragged deeper into the mess. "And you," Tony turned on Mark, his voice booming. "You're dumb enough to pick him over my customers? What's wrong with you?" "They were bullying him," Mark said, his voice small but steady. "It wasn't fair." "Fair?" Tony laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made the mugs rattle. "This ain't a playground, Mark. It's my cafe, and I don't need you playing hero for some greasy rider. You're slow, you're soft, and now this? You're done. Fired. Get out." The words hit like a slap, stealing Mark's breath. "Tony, please," he whispered, eyes stinging. "I didn't mean—" "Out!" Tony roared, slamming a fist on the counter, the sugar jar tipping over with a clatter. "Now!" The cafe went silent, the air heavy and still. The teenagers smirked, heads down. Ryan's gaze lifted, guilt shadowing his face. Mark's hands shook as he untied his apron, the strings slipping through his trembling fingers. He laid it on the counter, a crumpled heap, and turned toward the door. He stepped out with a lonely sound that followed him into the fading light, his courage crumbling under the weight of what it had cost. Mark stumbled onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air brushing his face, hands shoved deep in his pockets. The sun had slipped below the horizon, painting the sky a soft purple, but he couldn't feel its warmth. Tony's words, fired, done, out, rang in his ears, sharp and heavy. 5 years at the cafe, gone just like that. His chest tightened, a hollow ache spreading wide. He'd wanted to be someone, to do something right, and now he was nothing again. He didn't head home. His apartment, with its lumpy couch and humming fridge, felt too far, too empty. Instead, his feet carried him down the street, past the flickering streetlights, until he reached the old wooden bridge a few blocks away. It spanned a dry creek, its railings chipped and weathered, the water long gone. Mark leaned against it, staring at the cracked boards beneath his sneakers, the breeze tugging at his hair. Tears stung his eyes, and he let one fall, watching it soak into the wood. He wondered if this was it, if he'd always be the guy who tried and lost. A shuffle of footsteps broke the quiet. An older man, bundled in a worn coat, ambled onto the bridge, his cane tapping a slow rhythm. A younger guy in a delivery jacket walked beside him, carrying a bag of takeout. The older man squinted toward the cafe, where a faint rumble hummed in the distance. "You hear that, Pete?" he said, his voice gravelly but curious, nodding toward the sound. "Hundreds of bikers, some gang, they say, surrounding Tony's cafe right now. Never seen anything like it." The delivery guy, Pete, raised an eyebrow, adjusting his cap. "Bikers? What are they doing at a dump like that?" "Dunno," the older man said, leaning on his cane. "Engines roaring, lights everywhere. Something big's going down." They shuffled off, their voices fading into mutters, leaving the air buzzing with the distant growl. Mark's head snapped up, his heart lurching. Bikers? At Tony's? He wiped his face with his sleeve, the tear-streaked fabric rough against his skin, and strained to listen. The rumble grew, a deep pulse shaking the ground. Without a second thought, he pushed off the railing and ran, his sneakers slapping the pavement. His breath came fast, legs burning, but he didn't stop until he rounded the corner and saw it. Hundreds of motorcycles flooding the parking lot, their headlights slicing through the dusk like a swarm of fireflies. He skidded to a halt across the street, chest heaving, eyes wide at the sight. The bikes, 350 he'd hear later, lined up in tight rows, engines growling low, leather jackets glinting under the streetlights. At the front stood Ryan, his dark hair catching the glow, his jacket worn but steady. Tony hovered in the cafe doorway, his face pale, apron clutched in shaky hands. What is this?" he stammered, voice cracking over the noise. Ryan stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel, his tone calm but firm. "We're here for Mark." "Mark?" Tony choked out, gripping the frame. "The waiter?" "He's more than that," Ryan said, eyes unwavering. "He stood up for me when those kids wouldn't quit, and you fired him for it." A burly man with a gray beard and a patched vest pushed forward, his voice rough but kind. "Name's Jake. Iron Riders. Ryan told us what you did, kid. We don't let that slide." Tony's hands trembled, sweat shining on his brow. I didn't know." "Save it," Ryan said, cutting him off, sharp but quiet. "We're not here for you." Mark stood across the street, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. "Ryan?" he called, his voice small against the roar, stepping closer. Ryan turned, a soft smile breaking through the twilight. "You had my back, Mark. Now we've got yours." Tony's grip on the doorframe tightened, his knuckles white, but the sea of bikers, 350 strong, stared him down, their engines rumbling like a storm ready to break. The neon sign above flickered, casting a shaky red glow over his pale face. Jake stepped closer, his patched vest creaking as he crossed his arms. You messed up, Tony, he said, voice low and rough. Firing a kid for doing right? That's low, even for a guy like you. The crowd of riders murmured, a wave of agreement rippling through them. Tony's eyes darted from Jake to Ryan, then to the bikes filling his lot, their headlights glaring like accusing eyes. I didn't think, he stammered, sweat beading on his brow. Didn't think? Jake cut in, his tone sharp. You threw him out like trash. You're gonna fix this. Now. Ryan nodded, his gaze steady but hard. Apologize to him, Tony. He deserves that much. Mark stood across the street, his sneakers rooted to the pavement, heart pounding as he watched. The biker's presence felt like a shield, warm and solid, but Tony's shame was a bitter called, voice cracking. Come here, kid. Mark hesitated, the bridge's chipped railing still fresh in his mind, but he crossed the street, his steps slow, unsure. The engines hummed low, a steady pulse under the tension. Tony wiped his hands on his apron, grease smearing wider, and met Mark's eyes, his face flushed with something raw, guilt, maybe, or fear. Mark, Tony started, his voice low, trembling. I was wrong, okay? I shouldn't have fired you. Those kids were trouble, not you. I got mad, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry. The words hung there, heavy and clumsy, swallowed by the night air. Mark blinked, stunned, his chest tight with a mix of hurt and surprise. Tony rubbed his neck, his eyes dropping to the gravel. Look, you're a good worker. Always have been. Come back, all right? Your waiter job. It's yours again. I mean it. The bikers went quiet, their engines idling softer now, waiting. Mark stared at Tony, the flickering neon reflecting in his wide eyes. 5 years of wiping counters, of saying yes, flashed through his head. The apron, the chipped mugs, the loneliness stitched into every shift. Tony's apology was real, but it came too late, stained with shame. Ryan stepped forward, his boots crunching softly, breaking the silence. Mark, he said, his voice gentle but sure. You don't have to go back. If you want, you can come with us. Join our garage. Jake grinned, his beard catching the light. Yeah, kid. We fix bikes, cars, anything that rolls. Could use someone with your heart. You'd fit right in. Mark's breath hitched, his gaze shifting from Tony to Ryan, then to the sea of bikers behind them. Tony's face fell, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his mistake settled deeper. Mark, He tried, but his voice faltered, lost in the rumble. I don't know bikes, Mark said, his voice shaky, a tear slipping down his cheek as he turned to Ryan. You'll learn, Jake said, his laugh warm and rough. And you'll have us. Ryan's eyes met Mark's, soft but steady. You're not alone, Mark. Not with us. It's your call. The air buzzed with possibility, the engines a steady promise. Tony stood there, guilt etching lines into his face, his offer dangling unanswered. Mark wiped his eyes, a shaky smile tugging at his lips. The cafe's neon flickered once more, a fading echo of what he'd known, while the bikers waited, a new path stretching out before him. Okay, he said, voice breaking, turning to Ryan. I'm in. Tony's head dropped, shame swallowing him whole, his shoulders sinking under the weight of it as the bikers cheered, their voices crashing over the engines like a wave, loud, messy, alive. Mark stepped toward Ryan, his sneakers crunching gravel, leaving the cafe, and Tony's regret, behind in the dust, a cloud of it swirling in the air, thick and choking. His heart thudded, wild and uneven, a jumble of fear and something else, something warm, something he'd been chasing without knowing it. Ryan clapped a hand on his shoulder, steady and real, his smile soft but bright under the streetlights. You sure? He asked, voice cutting through the noise, gentle like he knew Mark's head was spinning. Mark nodded, quick and jerky, his breath hitching. Yeah, I think so. He glanced back at the cafe, its neon blinking weaker now, a memory already slipping away. 5 years of lonely shifts, of chipped mugs and quiet nights flickered in his mind, years of waiting, wanting, searching for something more. Friends, family, a place to belong. He'd never said it out loud, but it had been there, buried deep, an ache he'd carried since he was a kid alone in the world. Jake stepped up, his gray beard glinting, his laugh booming over the engines. "Welcome to the crew, kid. Garage is ours. Bikes, cars, whatever rolls in. You're one of us now." One of us. The words hit Mark like a rush of wind, knocking the air from his lungs. His eyes stung again, but this time the tears felt different. Lighter, like they were washing something away. I don't know how to fix stuff," he stammered, wiping his face, half laughing through the blur. "You'll figure it out," Jake said, grinning wide, his big hand ruffling Mark's hair like a brother might. "We've got your back." Ryan's gaze held his, steady and warm. "You've been alone too long, Mark. Not anymore. This is family. Family." The word cracked him open, raw and sudden, and Mark's shaky smile grew, trembling but real. The engines roared louder as the bikers revved up, a cheer rising again, wild and free. He looked around. Leather jackets, patched vests, faces lit with grins, and felt it. A warmth he'd been searching for, a belonging that filled the empty spaces he'd carried through all those lonely years. Tony stood frozen by the door, guilt shadowing his face, a man left behind as Mark found what he'd never had. A crew, a home, a family on the go. "I'm in," Mark said again, louder this time, his voice breaking with joy, stepping closer to Ryan. The cafe faded into the dust, and the road ahead opened wide, alive with the promise of something new. Mark stood there, the engine's roar wrapping around him like a heartbeat, and realized he found what he's been waiting for. In a crowd of hundreds, where miracles like this didn't touch everyone's lives, he'd stumbled into one. A gift not everybody got, but he did. Gratitude swelled in his chest, warm and full, and he closed his eyes to feel the peace within himself. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.